Okay, we're now recording. So again, welcome to the call, and I'm delighted that you're here with me on this beautiful Thursday morning. There's something about a Thursday that makes it feel right for a webinar. So I tend to do mine on a Thursday at different times so we can accommodate people from different time zones. So today's topic is about storytelling, which is really what I'm all about. My whole orientation, my whole business is related to incorporating storytelling into your marketing, which I sometimes call story-centered marketing. So we're going to talk today about a topic that you'll rarely hear anywhere else: 4 stories for your do not tell list. You've heard of the do not call list. Well, these are stories that are best left on your do not tell list, which means that you don't tell the story at all, or certainly not often. So I'm going to go through first some storytelling bad advice. Sometimes you'll hear advice like, you must have a story. And this is what gives rise to those stories that belong on the do not tell list. That's what gives rise to stories that are truly cringeworthy, because people say, well, you must have a story, or even worse, tell your story. And what that means is, go out somewhere, find something to tell. Look up a story in a book, or dig into your childhood or your distant past and tell a story. Well, you don't have to have a story, and you certainly don't have to have your story or a particular story. Oops. A second bit of bad advice, and this isn't really bad advice, this is just advice that is not necessary, and you hear it over and over. You don't need to hear for the 40th time, we are wired for stories. We probably are, at least most of us are, but that's not a reason to use stories in your business. Another piece of bad advice you'll hear is people remember stories, and that's a good thing. Well, it is true that people remember stories. They'll remember, if you think about it, plots of movies. Think about the last time you watched a movie or an episode of a series on television. You probably, if someone said, well, what was it about? You probably could go through pretty well and say, well, first they did this, and then they did this, and then they did that. And with a novel, especially something like a mystery novel, which I read too many of, you might have that type of sequence, because the different parts of the story hang together in your mind. Now, that's good if you're telling a story that supports your business, but it's not a good thing. In fact, it can actually work against you, because stories are so memorable that if you tell a story that is, I hate to use the word bad story, but yeah, a story that's not really appropriate, or a story that might hurt you, people remember that a long time. I was just talking to someone who remembered a story that was told at a conference she went to. And she didn't remember much about the conference or the speaker, but she remembered how horrible the story was. So we're going to talk about 4 types of stories for your no-tell or do not tell list. And I'm going to summarize them and then talk a little about each one. And I encourage you to ask questions at any point during the presentation. So first, type of story that is on the do not tell list is the origin story. Not any origin story, but when you're telling an origin story that doesn't seem to be about your business in a way that helps you. The second one is what we talked about earlier: just tell a story. So people will go to the greatest lengths, and you can see just by reading the story or listening to the story, you can tell they were looking for a story to tell. A third is a story that adds emotion work for your audience. And we'll look at what emotion work is. It makes your audience dig deeper into their own feelings and doesn't help them enjoy what you do. It doesn't help them appreciate what you do. It actually forces them to work and feel unpleasant as they listen to your story. And finally, the story that insults your audience. So we're going to look at these 4 in turn. First, let's look at the origin story, what I call the origin. What was the origin of? Well, this is the origin story that you hear a lot. Here are some examples. Went broke, lost everything. There was one story I heard recently that was truly, truly gripping and heartbreaking, where the person had lost everything. he had no money to pay rent. He was living with his family in a spare couch in the living room. When it came time for Christmas or family birthdays, he could not give gifts. He had no money to go to the Walmart and buy any kind of inexpensive gift. So he borrowed paper to write letters to wish them a happy birthday or a happy holiday. I'm taking a sip of water here. And then he had a drinking problem, or you may hear one horrendous story, the family was on welfare, and more. Well, these are the kind of stories that you might tell at a family reunion. You might tell a good friend. You probably will tell the person you want to be in a relationship with. If it looks like you're going to be married or living together for a long time, it might be relevant. But it's not necessarily the kind of story you want to tell your clients unless it's directly relevant to what you offer and unless it shows how you are a better person to serve them as compared to the competition. And the fix is to start with the purpose of your story. What is your story designed to do? Remember, one of the tenets of story-centered marketing is that you tell stories not for the sake of telling great stories, but you tell stories in order to accomplish a marketing goal. So if your marketing goal is, for example, to relate to your clients and show them that you understand where they're coming from, you tell one kind of story. When you tell an origin story generally has very specific purposes. You want to show your audience that you are truly passionate and you truly care about what you do, and that will serve them and lead you to go above and beyond the normal guidelines. For example, I worked with a lawyer who is in a unique specialty where she is involved in helping her clients collect debts. She tells a story about her own family and how when they got started, they had rental property and the tenants were not paying, and therefore they had trouble paying their own bills. Or they were in trouble because people owed them money. They were too generous with lending money to others, and they were not paid back, and therefore that caused them a great deal of hardship. Well, that story is also about her origin, her family, her motive, but it tells a really good story that supports her purpose. Because if you think about it, when we hear the term debt collection, we tend to think of an evil person who's seizing homes from widows and orphans and poor people. But she's saying, no, I'm actually helping people, because if someone doesn't pay a debt, someone else is going to be hurt. And that person is going to be really harmed by failure to pay a debt. And of course, she also defends people who are wrongly pursued in collections. But that works in that case because it shows why she is so passionate about what she does. Or another type of origin story is the one that is told by a business coach who has done very, very well. She says when she started, she was a life coach. And what she did as a life coach was she worked with people about personal issues and personal challenges, and she filled up her practice. Meanwhile, her fellow life coaches were struggling and couldn't get any clients. So they kept asking her, how are you doing it? What is your secret? So she started coaching them on their business, just as a nice thing to do. And they kept saying, well, maybe we should pay you because this is really helping. So then she became a business coach. Now that tells a story that makes sense for her business because it shows that she was recognized for her ability even before she declared, I'm a business coach. And it shows, it answers the question, why should I hire you? The second mistake, the second type of story that I recommend not telling is the just tell a story. This happens if you get emails and you get something like this. We're having a cold day, and that makes me realize how cold some of these messages can be. Or you have a whole story about the cold day and how it's snowing and how you have to do this. And then you in other words, you've got an idea and you think, well, I need to tell a story around it. So you find some story that is completely unrelated to the point you want to make, and you tell that story. I came close today. If you got the message I sent out today, and it will eventually be on my blog, where I was talking about mistakes, and I was sharing in my email 2 lead magnets to giveaways related or including this webinar, which is a form of a lead magnet. Both of them were about mistakes. And so I was talking about mistakes that people make in copywriting and storytelling. So I came close. I was trying to find something to open with that was a warm open. And that at least I felt had some advice that I could give that people could take away. Because one of my goals in my newsletters is to say only what will be useful and give value to the readers. So I rarely just send something out that is a pure invitation to buy. I try to include something that has value. And sometimes that means reaching for a story. So this is a tough one, but the key is think about if the story has nothing to do with what follows. You hear that in speeches too. If someone's giving a talk and they were told, open with a joke or open with a speech, with the story, and they tell the story and it really has nothing to do with the content of the talk, and everybody kind of says, okay, good story. And usually they forget the rest of the talk, which is what you want them to remember. So the key is to have stories that serve your purpose and that are related to what you're going to do. And again, only share stories if you have a purpose. Start with the purpose and not the story. A lot of training on storytelling talks about the type of story, the arc of the story, who is the hero, the conflict, the narrative, all these kinds of things. And they are important. But what I like to emphasize is, yes, those things are important to storytelling. But in marketing, we start with why are you telling the story, not just how do you tell the story. And the third type of story you don't want to tell is when you ask the audience to do your emotion work or to really make themselves feel something that takes energy, it takes effort to feel. So you have something like, here's the story of how my cat died, or they go into great detail about illness or problems or debt or personal issues. And these things are very serious. They're very worthy of sympathy and empathy. However, it's important to understand that when you're asking people to relate to you, you're asking them to do some kind of work. This actually comes from the work of a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild, who has written on a number of topics, including emotion work in a service business, when she talks about, for example, how flight attendants are often asked to empathize and to relate to passengers day after day, or people in the health professions are asked to do this. And this can lead to burnout. It's a very difficult challenge to relate to other people's problems. And when you tell a story to people you don't know, I mean, if you go on Facebook, you see this a lot, where people go into really deep stories. You're asking people to work, to do something that is not necessarily something they want to do. And you have to ask, is this serving the purpose? Do you have to do this? If you are, for example, I know someone who's coaching cancer survivors, and for her, it does make sense to have something because people want that. They are already in a state of emotional turmoil, and they are reassured by that story. They don't feel it's extra work, but for most audiences, it's extra work. And by the way, this is my current cat who is very much alive. So the fix, of course, is to stay focused. Remember, you don't need to be vulnerable. If I had to pick the single worst piece of advice that I hear about stories, about marketing, it's make yourself vulnerable. I go into this in much more detail in my book on storytelling, which is Grow Your Business One Story at a Time, that I'll talk about shortly. But the whole idea is that when you present yourself as vulnerable, if you're not already extremely successful, your story can backfire. Because people won't respect you more and feel closer to you. They'll think, what's wrong with you? I mean, think about this. If a superstar, an entertainment star, someone who's been really recognized and featured and has won awards for acting and singing, whatever, goes on stage and tells a story about some dumb thing they did, we all say, wow, that's great. They're human. But if someone is just getting started, or if it's someone we don't know and they tell the same story, we think, something's wrong. We don't want to know. It's almost annoying. So be aware that you don't have to tell a story to be vulnerable, and it's not about you. Your stories always start with your audience and with your purpose. The third error is insulting your audience. The third type of story you don't want to tell. If you get a lot of email, like I do, about marketing or about any field, you'll start to notice that some marketers have stories about their clients, which seem to be saying, boy, my client was really dumb. Frankly, I find those insulting. If you think about it, you need to respect your clients. They're smart people. If you don't respect them, don't accept them as clients. That's my personal belief, and I feel very strongly about that. So you hear stories like I saw one recently where the person sent an email and said, the client just didn't get it. I tried to tell them what to do, and they kept asking me questions, and it was no surprise they finally failed. Well, that's not a very heartwarming story. There are other ways to make that point. Or another one where people were talking at actually a training session on marketing. There was two people discussing what the challenge was of getting their clients to pay attention to their advice. Even though they were talking from a marketing perspective, they were still talking about their clients. And people listening were still looking at them as saying, well, maybe I could be their client. So when you say something like, oh, they want to make 20K a month and they're just getting started, how dumb is that? That's insulting. They don't know. Respect them. So whenever you start to tell a story, think of a way to frame it so you're not inadvertently insulting your audience or encouraging other people to disrespect them or even make fun of them. Because if I'm going to be your client, I want to be totally confident that you respect me. This is surprisingly common. The fix is to think of your client's backstory and maybe think about walking in their shoes, to use a cliche that works. They're just getting started. They're scared. In the 20K a month group, they probably heard, sure, you can make 20K a month, and they wonder why they can't make 20K a month. So in summary, let's take a look at what to take away. And if you have questions, feel free to ask at this point. Begin every story with, what's my marketing purpose? Before you start to tell the story, ask, what is the purpose of my story? Why do I want to tell the story? How is it going to serve my marketing efforts? And second, remember, you don't have to tell a story or a particular type of story. You can use bullet points. You could use examples that are not stories. You can do all kinds of things, but you don't have to tell any story. It's certainly not your story. In fact, answer to the question, what's your story, may not be about you at all. And finally, focus on the audience and speak to their backstory. One of the things I talk about in my book and elsewhere is the fact that your clients come to you with a backstory, which is sort of how I got here, what made me decide to come here, what did I do before, what did I try that worked, what did I try that didn't work. And that's their backstory, and that's what you speak to. That's where you get a sense of their objections, of what they're trying to avoid working with you, why they may hesitate to work with you. So if you want to learn more, and we're going to take a few questions at the end. I try to keep these 30 minutes. We're running a little bit early today, and I'll try to answer some. I've got a couple questions here. First, and feel free to ask more. Learn more. First, I have my book on Amazon that's very low priced. It's at this link, mycopy.info/KB story. This has a lot of information that I have not seen anywhere else. It's a really unique take on how to tell stories specifically for marketing, how to stand out with stories. Because a lot of people will tell you how to tell the story in terms of the arc of the story. They tell you what really amounts to a fairy tale. And what I'm telling you here is Cinderella makes a lousy marketing story. It was a great movie. It's a great fairy tale, but it's not appropriate for marketing. I also offer one-to-one consultations. The most popular one is at this link, mycopy.info/CC. A lot of people find these more valuable than ongoing long-term coaching or mastermind groups, because in one session, we get an awful lot covered. We may start out looking at your website or your sales letter or something you've written or something you want to write. And we usually end up going on to talk about your whole marketing, your positioning, your message. And sometimes people see complete transformations of their marketing within one session. And I've added something recently called copy coaching. This is for people who want to become better copywriters without necessarily taking a lot of training or identifying as copywriters. This is at this link by copy.info/copy coaching, where we actually go through in detail what you've written, what you'd like to write, and I can coach you on how to make it better. My goal is so that you write the copy yourself, but people think it was written by a pro because you get my help in doing this. So if you've got any questions, you can follow up by reaching me at kathygoodwin.com/contact, and I answer all queries, answer all questions. So thanks for joining me today, and let's see if we've got any questions. Okay, question is, what kinds of stories should I use? You've given us some examples of bad stories. What are some good ones? And I want to make a point, they're not bad stories. They're just the kind of stories that don't serve a purpose. So if you start with, why am I telling the story? You will generally be on the right track to tell a story that will serve your purpose. One example is, if you say to me, and someone asked me this recently, tell me one kind of story that every business owner needs to have. And I would say that is a success story. A success story is not about you. Success story is a story about something your client did and did well that you help them accomplish. So you have a situation where the client is really more like the hero, but you're the guide and helper. So your story might be something like, when Sally came to me, she was just getting her business started. She had no idea what to do, and certainly no idea what to do next. We worked together for 3 months. I reviewed her idea. We suggested a different type of audience. We modified her message. We rewrote all her materials. We saved her $100 a month on her tech support expenses. And now Sally is earning a very comfortable income. You have to be careful with number disclosures. I always avoid them because you can get in trouble legally. But that's an example of a story that everyone could tell, even if you're new. If you've only been in business a couple months, you probably have stories that you could share with your audience that are based on how your clients succeeded with your help. Now, if you're just getting started and you don't have success stories, you could tell them in a different way. What you would say is, here is the type of story that my clients would tell after I worked with them. You don't lie. You don't say, oh, I did this. But you say, these are the types of stories that my clients might tell after we work together. And that gives your clients an example. And in fact, one of the things you can do as an exercise, I'm just getting into this. This is a sneak preview of something I'm going to be adding to my collection of stories. You can ask your clients before they start to tell you a story, a transformation story, of what they would like to tell a story about your work together. So what would they say after you've been working together for 1 session or 3 months or 6 months? What kind of a testimonial would they write? What would they say happened? So they might say, well, we started working together and Kathy told me everything and it was like magic and it happened overnight. And if someone says that, if you're the marketer, you say, wait a minute, that's not the kind of story that we want you to go into this relationship with. We want you to go into our working relationship with the story like, Kathy gave me some suggestions and I worked very hard to implement them. And then I started to see results. We fine-tuned them. We worked some more. Soon I found I was working less and the clients were coming more automatically. And eventually I was on track and I was gaining traction and I didn't have to feel that every day I was starting over. That's the kind of story that your clients can take away. And if you start with that kind of story, first start with the transformation story that you would like your clients to tell, and you can use that as the basis to write your copy. And then you can also use that as a way of onboarding your clients, of saying to them, hey, what kind of results do you expect? Tell me a story about what you think you would be saying after we work together for an hour or a month or 6 months, and see what they say and see if it's a realistic story and if there's a way you can help them change their story. So those are some of the examples of good kinds of stories that you might tell. Okay, another question is, what about the just tell a story? That actually is a trap And I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll say something about it, about just tell a story. It can be very frustrating when you get an email from someone who tells a story about something like, my husband and I just went on a camping trip and we did this and this. And oh, by the way, that relates to the topic of this message. Now, what some people do, which is perfectly fine. The ultimate rule is if it works, do it. If it doesn't work, don't do it. The rules that, or I'm suggesting, are not even rules. They're more like ideas or something to think about, because you can violate every rule in the book and make a lot of money. You can follow every rule of the book and have nothing. So when you start an email with a story that is totally unrelated, like, as I said, my husband and I went camping, we did this, it might be a style. There are some people who tell a story about their personal life, and that's just the way they open every email. Usually they're very, very successful people who have a large list and a very significant following. They're identified, their whole marketing position, their message is about them as a person. People want to know more about them. They're like mini celebrities in their own tiny orbit. And people want to know, what are they doing? Where are they going? Why are they doing it? Some people may remember when Alexandria Brown had a different type of marketing than she does now. And she was that kind of a marketer, where she was featured. People like to read about her, and she would write about how she went out on a girls' night out in LA and how she went to this event and the fun things she did. And she was kind of a personality that people enjoyed following. And when she wrote about her cat, people were like, wow, we want to hear more, that kind of thing. If you're marketing as a personality, as a strong out there personality, and you can pull it off, then yeah, you would want to tell things about yourself. And then you say, okay, now that I've told you where I am in my life, let's get to the offers, let's get to the meat of things. And you can certainly do that. But a lot of people will try to bring in something that's totally irrelevant, that has nothing to do with whatever they're doing. I'll give you an example of a good way of doing it too, from a very, very good marketer that I followed, where he said one time he was giving a webinar, and in the middle of the webinar, some family members showed up at the front door, and you couldn't ignore them. I mean, you can't just say, I pretend you're not there. You can't tell them to go away. They're older family members. They're very respected family members. So he interrupted and told people, sorry, I have to go, and I'll be right back. And he said, after he did that, people actually respected him more, because they saw a side of his personality they had not seen before. And they got to see him as a person, a three-dimensional person. And then he went into a whole thing about how important it was to be seen as a person, which, as I've said, makes sense in some cases. And he is a very personality type marketer. He talks about himself and people follow him. I mean, it's the kind of thing where I open his emails because I see they're from him, and a lot of people do too. So in that case, it made sense. And his whole point definitely followed smoothly from the interruption. But if he had talked about something different, if he had said, well, that's an example of an interruption, and now today I'm going to bring you an interruption with this. No, that's force. It doesn't flow smoothly. The story doesn't relate to the point of what he is talking about. If he were going to say, let me interrupt you with an offer of something to make your website run more smoothly. So that's it for today. It is exactly a half an hour, and I don't want to go over. Last call for questions, comments. If you enjoyed this, please be sure and tell me. If you did not enjoy this, please tell me what you would have liked to see differently. And stop for today. And I want to thank you so much for joining me here. It's a cloudy Thursday. See, irrelevant story, but I want to add a touch at the end. Cloudy Thursday in Philadelphia. And I hope to see you again on a future training online, or perhaps we'll do a one-to-one consultation. If you're the right client for me, I'd love to work with you. Thanks again, and have a magnificent Thursday.